that aerobic threshold tends to line up with where the athlete is burning the most fat. And because of that, they can tend to do quite a lot of work in and around that intensity.
That Triathlon Show, episode 79. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host, Michael, and on today's episode, I am very happy to announce that we have one of the heavy hitters in applied triathlon science on the show, Alan Couzens. The topic that we'll dig deep into today is lab testing. So that's when you're going to a lab and you have your blood lactate analyzed or tested, or you have your respiratory markers measured in a specific protocol to get detailed insights into your physiology, whether it's, as we talked about, the lactate levels, or even your metabolic physiology, how much fat versus carbohydrates you're burning at different intensities. So we'll answer questions like what kinds of lab tests are there out there and what information do we get from these different tests? How do these tests compare to classic time trial field tests like a 20-minute functional threshold power test? And is it worthwhile? Is it worth the investment going to a lab? And if so, for whom? For any athlete? Or are there certain kinds of athletes that should seek out a lab more so than others? And how do we use training zones based on lab tests? And how might they differ from training zones that you get from the classic field tests mentioned? And finally, how do we determine and use fat metabolism results, and how important is this in triathlon, and especially in long course triathlon? Before the interview, this episode is sponsored by Precision Hydration. If you suffer from cramps in racing or training, one of the likely reasons is that you're not adequately replacing the electrolytes that you lose from your sweat. So to learn more about this topic, Andy from Precision Hydration wrote a great blog post called Why Do Athletes Suffer from Cramps? I linked to it in the links and resources below, and you can find it on precisionhydration.com. If you want to buy any of their hydration or electrolyte products, use the discount code THATTRIATHLONSHOW for 15% off. The episode is also sponsored by Ventum. The Ventum 1 is a super fast bike that, based on wind tunnel testing, has been proven to be more aerodynamic than all of its competitors, because it's got no down tube and no seat stays, and it's got an integrated water bottle in the top tube. You can read all about Ventum and their bikes and order one for yourself on ventumracing.com. That's linked to down below in the show notes, and they ship all over the world. But in the US and Canada, you can get a special delivery option with Deliver Build Plus Bike Fit as a sweet bonus. Again, that's ventumracing.com. Here's a short introduction to Alan Couzens. He's a triathlon coach and exercise physiologist at Endurance Corner, and he resides in Boulder, Colorado, where he has coached 40-plus triathletes to qualify for Kona. But he really has coached all levels of triathletes, from first-time Ironman athletes to elite-level triathletes. He tends to focus more on the long course side of things, and he has a master's in sports science from Western Sydney University, and a fantastic Twitter account that I highly recommend that you follow if you're on Twitter. It's probably my favorite Twitter account, to be honest. It's at Alan_Couzens, and his blog, Couzens, by the way, is spelled Coucens, and that's it, said the second C. I'm not sure if I get the difference between the early letter in the alphabet and the late letter in the alphabet good enough to pronounce it the American way as opposed to the British way, so let's stick with said. Yeah, anyway, his blog is on www.alancouzens.com. And that, again, is among my favorite resources to follow. Many great blog posts there. If I were to answer my own rapid-fire question on favorite book, blog, or resource, to be honest, I would probably pick Alan's pretty high up there on the list. So without any further ado, let's talk lab testing with Alan Couzens. Welcome, Alan, to That Triathlon Show.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for the invite. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's really great to have you. We were just talking a bit off air about how, with my own engineering background, your style of writing and other things that you have, your Twitter account is another example. Definitely is one that appeals to me. And I was mentioning in the previous episode, actually, on the show that your Twitter account is the Twitter account to follow, maybe, of all triathletes. So it's great to have you here, and we have a specific topic which is great to be able to narrow down on the scope of this interview, and that is lab testing and its benefits. You're an exercise scientist, exercise physiologist, so you have a whole heap of experience in that. So can you just start by telling us what are the different kinds of lab testing that are available?
Yeah, for sure. There's three main categories, I guess, that you'll find depending on the particular lab that you go to, or the particular facility. And the first one would be lactate testing, which is something that's been around for some period of time now, and it is sort of through technology worked its way into home units, and athletes can buy their own portable units and do lactate testing. The second category would be metabolic testing, so utilizing a metabolic cart. And generally speaking, that sort of testing is more the domain of research institutions, hospitals, universities, those sorts of things who can afford those metabolic carts. And then the third one, of course, would be field testing, which is a little bit of a gray area. Some labs, quote unquote labs, will be doing sort of critical power testing and that sort of thing with athletes as well, and obviously that transfers to athletes doing a lot of home testing and testing on their courses and that sort of thing as well. So I think they're the three main categories of testing, and each has its benefits and drawbacks, I guess.
Yeah, let's get into that. What are the benefits and drawbacks, and what's the information that you get from those different kinds of tests?
Yeah, I think lactate testing is a really useful window into an athlete's physiology at any one point in time. So when you look at a lactate test, you get a particular curve that's really specific to that athlete. And it's very, very helpful in terms of identifying particular training zones for that athlete. Identifying where those inflection points are on the curve for that specific athlete, so that you can set objectives as to where you want to target the training within specific power or pace zones for the next training block and sort of moving forward. So I think lactate testing is a really good kind of snapshot, of an athlete's physiology across a whole bunch of ranges. So I really like it for that purpose.
How do we do a lactate test? What's the protocol?
Yeah, that's a good question. My preferred way of doing it is with fairly long stages, so like 5-minute stages, starting at a very low intensity, and that is where a lot of lactate tests go wrong. Athletes have a tendency to start at too higher a level, too high a power output. So I think it's really important to be very conservative with the first stage that you do. And generally for athletes that I'm working with, that's somewhere around 50% of their functional threshold power. So it's very, 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 very low intensity for that first stage. And then progressively ramping up every 5 minutes, depending on the level of the athlete and how high the test is going to go. We might be ramping anything from 15 to 30 watts per stage.
Yeah, so for those listeners that may not be at all familiar with this kind of testing, what you do is that you ramp the pace or the power, and then you stay at that specific intensity for a while, and at each point you draw a blood sample, and then you can analyze that blood sample and see the lactate concentration in the blood at that particular point. And that's then what you plot against the power or pace output, and that's where you can get those inflection points that you talked about. And you mentioned the training zones, so let's stick with the lactate test for now. How do you set training zones based on a lactate test, and how is it better than field testing?
Yeah, so the way that we set training zones is really based on where those inflection points on the curve occur. And the first inflection point, and probably the most important one for the athletes that I'm dealing with, is that first point where the curve goes from a flat line to starting to ramp up. So, generally when we start the test for the first 2 or 3 stages, the athlete's lactate will be, 1.5 millimoles, maybe 1.7, something in that sort of range. And then at a certain point, the lactate will start to ramp up. And that point, that first stage where it starts to do so, we call the aerobic threshold. And that's a really critical point for setting training intensities. We do a lot of work in and around that aerobic threshold with the Ironman athletes that I work with.
And why is that? Let's get into that as well. Why do you do so much work at that aerobic threshold? And is there a difference if you're an Ironman athlete compared to if you're training for Olympic or sprint distance races?
Yeah, the aerobic threshold tends to line up really well with the maximal fat oxidation number. So if we're doing a lactate test where we're also getting metabolic data, we can see how those two things line up. But generally speaking, that aerobic threshold tends to line up with where the athlete is burning the most fat. And because of that, they can tend to do quite a lot of work in and around that intensity. It's well fueled because we have a lot of energy reserves in the form of stored fat. So it's a really, really good balance point between high enough intensity to be getting some aerobic benefit in the slow twitch and fast oxidative fibers, but still low enough that we're fueling it in a way that's very sustainable for the athlete.
And that translates well to the kind of demands that an Ironman race has. You can sustain that for the duration of the Ironman. What about if you're focusing on the shorter distance, Olympic and sprint distance races? Is the aerobic threshold still as important, or what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that the volume is important. Pretty much irrespective of the athlete's specialized duration. Certainly for a large part of the training year, the pure volume, the aerobic base is something that's very important for all endurance athletes. All the way down to even 800-meter track runners. That aerobic base is still something that makes up a large portion of the energy generation for the event. So I think it's a really, really critical area to spend a lot of time on, and that's something that guys like Stephen Seiler, with his 80-20 kind of breakdown of optimal training intensity, he sort of applies that across the board irrespective of specialization.
Yeah. So again, going back to those training zones, you will spend a lot of time close to the aerobic threshold. Will you actually do some sort of other categorization into zones that are at a percentage of the aerobic threshold, or will you use the anaerobic threshold, or how do you then work with the results that you get for an athlete when you have done a lactate test? How many zones do they get, and so on?
Yeah, so I guess that's a good lead into the other form of testing, the metabolic testing. And when we do a metabolic test with an athlete, we also get ventilatory markers of where the ratio between the VO2 and VCO2 changes as we do that progression, up through the stages. So the VT, the ventilatory threshold, or the first change that we see in that relationship between VO2 and VCO2, it occurs a little bit beyond the aerobic threshold. So that's kind of the first zone marker that I use with the athletes that I'm working with, and again, usually that zone in particular really lines up well with the athlete's maximal fat oxidation. So that's a key zone. Beyond that, we start to look at the anaerobic threshold for the athletes. So where the blood lactate makes its second rise, where the ramp of the blood lactate takes off again. And that's another critical point because it kind of limits the steady state intensity of the athlete. So when we're setting longer intervals, when we're doing tempo work, we want to focus it just a little bit before that point.
Yeah, so essentially you have then three zones. You have below the aerobic threshold and between the aerobic and anaerobic, and above the anaerobic is like in, for example, the Steven Seiler studies and intensity distribution publications that exist, where they tend to just split up training zones into three different zones. Is that the way you do it as well?
Yeah, with I guess with the small exception that those studies use that first ventilation threshold as the key limiter for low intensity work, and so that's just a little bit north of that aerobic threshold if we're using blood lactate markers. So it I will kind of make that distinction as well, and we'll do a lot of work just below that aerobic threshold.
Okay, got it. But then we all know that there are a lot of field tests to do, and we have the 20-minute functional threshold power tests and so on, and then there are calculations that you can use to get your 5 or 6 zones, whatever system you like to use. What's your take on that? How do they stack up against a lab test?
Not well, I would say. Just because.
Good, honest answer.
Yeah, just because for those sort of tests, even at 20 minutes, there is an anaerobic component to those tests, and I find that for a lot of athletes, they put out their best 20-minute numbers, or a lot of serious high-level athletes, they actually put out their best 20-minute numbers very early in the season, so they tend to not line up as well with when the athlete's aerobic threshold numbers and, when their race-specific power numbers are at the highest. I see a bit of almost an inverse relationship there, where the best 20-minute tests happen close to the off-season when the athlete's fresh and ready to give a good anaerobic sort of effort.
That's very interesting. So you're saying that you do a lot of good testing early in the season, and then you train. If you train on a percentage of that FTP that you get, then your aerobic threshold will be kind of inflated artificially because of anaerobic components and so on, and you won't necessarily get as much benefit from that quote unquote aerobic threshold training that you think you're doing, but that you're really not doing. Is that a correct interpretation of that, what you were saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the 20-minute test has its appeal in that it gives athletes, or it tends to give athletes, a higher number than what a lab test would give them, and so I think that there's a natural tendency to athletes like it. We sort of like to see higher numbers, and there's a certain appeal there, but I think it generally, if we compare it to those threshold lactate inclinations that we see in the lab, it is higher. It's inflated for most athletes.
Okay, very good and practical advice. And okay, we get now that it's more accurate if you go to the lab and get a lactate test, or even a metabolic test, and get that ventilatory threshold instead. But it is an investment. It costs some money. So who should consider doing it? For whom is it extra important to go and get a lab test, and which athletes may potentially skip it? Or do you really think that it's a must thing for any athletes?
Yeah, I think it's more a question of frequency. It is $150 to $250 sort of proposition in US dollars for a metabolic test. So it's certainly not the sort of thing that you're going to be doing every single block of training. So I think it's more a question of frequency. I think that the way that I like to look at it is, it's good to always check in on the metabolic status of the athlete at least once a year, and depending on what we find, with respect to whether fat burning is a weakness or something that we want to improve, we might want to do those sort of tests more frequently than that. But I think at least once a year for any athlete who's really serious about customizing their training and doing the sort of training that is focused on their particular physiology, that getting into the lab once a year is definitely worthwhile.
Yeah. And I'm going to ask, you have been writing a lot about lactate testing for Ironman training on your blog. I'll have a couple of links on the show notes page on thattriathlonshow.com to those blog posts. They're well worth a read. So do you think that for Ironman athletes, potentially there's reason to test a bit more frequently, because it might be even more important for them to know where that aerobic thresholds stack up? Or what's your take on that? That was sort of my interpretation of your blog posts, that it's really, really critical for them. But tell me what you think. Should Ironman triathletes test more frequently than once per year, and just in preparation for their key races?
Yeah, I mean, I think the lactate curve changes. Ideally, it changes every block. We sort of identify zones on the curve that we want to address for a given block of training, and we have an idea of how we want the curve to change, and it's always useful to at the end of the block to actually do a test and see if we're seeing what we wanted to see, and I think with lactate in particular, it is a lot more accessible. You can buy a good portable lactate tester for a couple of $100. You can go in with your buddies and sort of plan a testing day once every month, or once every couple of months, and just kind of test each other. And it's a pretty affordable way of doing things. And it's not that hard once you kind of get a few key techniques down with lactate sampling. It's pretty easy, and it's something that I think gives the athletes a lot of visibility into their training, and you can definitely get hooked on seeing those changes in the curve.
Yeah, good point. And it's definitely true that it's becoming more accessible. And any Lisbon triathletes around, and you're interested in getting down for a lactate test together in a group, then contact me. I'm interested as well. So what about the fat metabolism test? That's another thing that you've been writing about a lot, and the relevance especially for long course triathletes. You've been writing about metabolically limited athletes and comparing them to even ketogenic athletes, and then metabolically balanced athletes. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think for Ironman, the important thing to sort of be aware of about Ironman as a particular event is that it's really a test of metabolism more than fitness. You see athletes kind of making the jump up from short course racing to Ironman, and a lot struggle, despite being very, very fit, very aerobically fit athletes who might have done well over the short course. So there's no immediate guarantee that just because you've got a very high VO2 max or a high threshold that you're going to be a good Ironman athlete, and I think a lot of the reason for that is because it's fundamentally metabolically limited. You need to be able to fuel the effort that you aim to sustain for the race. So I think knowing where you are currently with respect to that, and being able to compare that as a benchmark in the same way that we might compare, your functional threshold power with with typical numbers for Ironman athletes is very, very useful. And it's I definitely think on the metabolic side of things that for an Ironman athlete, knowing where his or her fat burning currently is super important.
So can you describe that, what you get when you do a fat metabolism test, or a metabolism test in general, as it's called, that obviously measures the different components of what you're oxidizing for energy, fat and carbohydrate. What is it that you get? How does it look visually? If you can try to describe that, and how to then make sense of that and use that to establish where you are, and so on, in terms of Ironman racing.
Yeah, ideally, how it looks, or how I like to kind of view the tests, is I have a lactate curve kind of in the foreground, and then in the background, I'll have a stack diagram where it shows the amount of fat burning of the athletes is kind of shaded for each of those training power zones as the test goes up. So you'll see a nice little fill of how much fat the athlete is burning through each power zone, and you can kind of compare that to the training zones that are coming from the lactate test as well. So you can see not only on the Y scale how high the fat burning goes and how much fat burning the athlete has, but also on the X scale how much fat they're burning in those key race intensities, and I think that distinction is really important, because you mentioned, ketogenic diets, and that's something that can really elevate that Y-axis. You can see athletes who are burning 10 and 12 and 14 kilocalories per minute of fat, which is just an insane amount of fat burning. It's really, really high. But the key question really is, how much fat is the athlete burning in their race intensities? And that's what we want to maximize for our Ironman athletes.
Yeah, and we'll link to that post on the blog post, and maybe if you have some pictures of an example picture of that lactate curve with the fat burning percentages, the stacked diagram, then maybe we can put that on the show notes page as well to give a visual representation of it. One more question about the lab testing is, what should athletes consider when they seek out a lab? Are there differences in what different service providers offer in the quality of their services, and anything else to think about when you start looking for somebody to do a lab test on you?
Yeah, there are a lot of things to think about, unfortunately, and a lot of things to check. It pays to do your homework. I guess the first really important consideration is the quality of the equipment that's being used, and we're now at the point where a lot of this metabolic testing is starting to trickle down to health clubs and smaller labs, and some of it does okay, but some of it has a really, really hard time handling the sort of flow rates and the sort of volume that we see on even average level athletes. So we I'll often get a test from an athlete, and I know their race performance, and I know what sort of level they're at, and it'll say their VO2 max is reading at 65, 70 mils per kilo, and I know that's not that level of athlete. And then I'll ask them, what machine they used for the metabolic cart. And it's generally one of these cheaper units, So my safest bet is to direct athletes to colleges that have an exercise phys department, or to hospitals, those sort of places that can afford the $20,000 and $30,000 numbers that good met carts are costing. So that would be the first thing I would do, is look to universities if you're planning on getting good results for the test. The second thing that I think is really important is what we were talking about with the lactate test, being willing to start at a very low level of intensity and to do those longer 5-minute stages for the test. And of course, it's a balance between the lab wanting to make money, and keeping the test short, and you getting good results. So I think it's important to find a lab that's willing to run the sort of protocol that is going to give you good results, and be willing to start at those low levels and be willing to spend 45-50 minutes with you as an athlete. And I've written about that on my blog, in terms of what the protocol should look like for you. And I even did up a little calculator for you based on, what your current functional threshold numbers are. So you can kind of go to the university or the lab that you choose with this set protocol, saying, this is what I want to run. Is this something you can do for me? And most universities are pretty good with that, especially if you say, this is what my coach wants me to run, so that you sort of give it a little bit of credibility or a little bit of credence that you're not just making stuff up. But
yeah, exactly. You even had the pitch for how to make them run the test on you in that blog post. I remember reading that.
It's important. It's very useful because I think give it left to their own devices, labs will tend to do the easiest tests that they can manage.
Yeah. And finally, what about if we have the option of choosing between the metabolic tests and the lactate tests, are there price differences? What are the considerations there? Who should go for which one of the tests, or is it a no-brainer in one way or the other what to choose?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely worthwhile at least once a year to get that metabolic data. Ideally you'll kill two birds with one stone, and you'll get both metabolic and lactate data from the one test. But without the metabolic cart, you won't be getting those fat burning numbers, which are really important to especially to Ironman athletes.
Yeah, perfect. All right, let's move into some rapid fire questions, unless you have anything else to add on this topic of lab testing or how it compares to field testing.
No, I think we covered the important stuff.
Excellent. All right, rapid fire questions then. What's your favorite book, blog, or resource related to triathlon?
Ooh, my favorite resource related to triathlon is probably the athletes that I coach, to be honest with you. I think that's where I get my best information, is just experimenting on those guys. But in terms of blogs, or in terms of books, there's a really good book called Endurance Training. It's a little blue book by Newman, Futzner, and Burbalk, and it's a go-to resource for me.
Never heard of that. That's really interesting. I thought that I had heard of all of these books, but okay, that's a new one. What do you wish you had known or wish you had done differently at some point in your triathlon journey?
Well, I was probably more serious as a swimmer personally, as an athlete, than a triathlete. So I'll go back to my swimming days. And thinking back, in retrospect, I think one of the biggest limiters that I had was that I listened to all of the nonsense about having to eat like 80% carbs in your diet. And, I was just a big sugar fiend. So if I could go back and do it again, I would eat a more balanced diet. And I think nutritionally, that had a lot of negative effects on sickness and energy levels and those sorts of things.
Typical swimmer cereal diet. Finally,
yeah, it's not good. It's not good.
Finally, who's somebody in triathlon or your field of expertise that you look up to?
I can't really nail it down to one person, so you're gonna have to bear with me. I might go over the 15 seconds, but
yeah, go on.
But two definite people who've had a huge impact on myself would be Joe Friel. Somebody who I've looked up to for a very long time. I've had the good fortune to chat with and learn from a little bit, in person over recent years. And Dr. Phil Maffetone, somebody who I think was way ahead of his time in when he was working with Mark Allen and the Boom brothers and Mike Pigg and some really big names in triathlon. And I think that his style of coaching and the importance that he put on health and the holistic athlete. I really respect that, and I look up to him a lot.
Great. If listeners want to learn more about you, you have your blog, as we mentioned, on alancouzens.com, and your Twitter account is at Alan_Couzens. And are those the best places to get to know more about you and connect with you?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm pretty active on Twitter, probably a little bit too active, but that's definitely the best place to reach me.
Yeah, perfect. All right, everybody. This has been Alan Couzens. It was a really great time talking to you, Alan.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, likewise. I really enjoyed it.
There you go. I really hope that you enjoyed that episode and that you found it useful. I guess that my main takeaway is that really lab testing is highly beneficial to do at least once a year for any triathlete, but especially if you're a long course triathlete. Trying to get that metabolic testing done would be highly critical, because you can then learn so much about your physiology and your main limiter in Ironman racing. Remember, Alan is not the first person who has pointed out that your metabolism and your metabolic limitations are your biggest limitations in Ironman racing. Jesse Kropelnicki, one of the best episodes, in my opinion, of on the show so far, episode 40, he immediately pointed that out as well, and that is mathematically the case, because how do we really fuel an event as long as an Ironman? So that's why I think that Alan is on to something here when he says that the metabolic testing is really critical for all athletes, but especially long course athletes. You can find the show notes for today's episode and all other episodes on thattriathlonshow.com. And again, that's where we'll have some pictures and explain this in more detail, because some of the things are a bit technical, so it will be helpful for you, I think, to see some visuals of what we're talking about. Alan promised to send me a couple of pictures, so I hope I'll get them in time for the show notes. And if you have any questions, just contact me or Alan on Twitter. My handle is at SciTriat. Alan, again, is Alan_Couzens. And that will be in the show notes so that you can find them. Big thank you to Ventum for sponsoring That Triathlon Show. They are a super bike, the super fast bike. You can go to ventumracing.com to read up on their wind tunnel test. That there is a big report there that goes into details on exactly how fast that bike really is. And if you saw Lauren Brandon at the Ironman World Championships this year, you saw her on her Ventum bike. She's just one of many pros. Cody Beals is another one. We've had him on the show, great friend of That Triathlon Show. Ventum bikes, they're fast, they're pretty, they're up and coming. Go check them out, ventumracing.com. And thank you also to Precision Hydration for sponsoring this episode. And remember to take their free online sweat test on precisionhydration.com to get a personalized hydration strategy for your next race. And use the discount code ThatTriathlonShow, all one word, for 15% off.